The county clerk didn't look up from his desk when Tilda Mercer set the death certificate and the deed paperwork in front of him. He read through it slowly, the way some people read when they want you to understand they're not impressed. And then he pushed his glasses up and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't quite not one either. "The Kessler bottomland," he said, not to her, to his screen. 44 acres. The woman at the neighboring desk turned her head. "You know what they call that parcel?" the clerk said, and now he was looking at her over the glasses, with the expression of a man who has just been handed a joke he didn't tell. "The drowning field. Has been for 30 years. Your uncle, God rest him, paid taxes on it every year, and nobody ever figured out if that made him loyal or just stubborn. He stamped the paperwork. You sure you want to file the transfer?" Tilda Mercer was 28 years old. She had driven 4 hours to get to the Morrow County courthouse, and she had exactly 1 tank of gas left to get home on, and the job she'd held for 3 years. County agricultural extension worker. Had been eliminated 6 weeks earlier when the state cut the program's funding in the new budget. She put her hand flat on the counter and said, "File it." He filed it. Behind her, she heard the woman at the neighboring desk say something low to a third person she hadn't noticed, and then there was a short exchange she didn't catch, and then quiet. The kind of quiet that meant everyone had said what they thought and was satisfied with the conclusion. She picked up her copy of the deed and walked out into the February cold. She'd been to the Kessler bottomland once, when she was 11 years old, and her Uncle Ray had driven her out to show her what he'd been paying taxes on for 15 years. It was 44 acres in the low floodplain of Copper Creek, hemmed in by 2 ridges, and in a wet spring it sat under 8 inches of standing water for most of March and April. The rest of the year it was a dense tangle of cattail, buttonbush, invasive phragmites reed, and whatever the beavers had engineered that season. There were 3 active beaver dams on the property. There had been 3 when she'd visited as a child, which either meant they were extraordinarily well maintained, or that new generations had taken up residence in the exact same spots their grandparents had chosen. She knew what everyone in Morrow County thought about the land. She'd heard it enough over the years when she'd mentioned Ray Kessler's name. It was the kind of land that appeared on lists of county tax burden parcels. It was the kind of land that a man holds onto for no logical reason, and his relatives quietly dread inheriting. What she also knew, because she had spent 3 years walking wetlands and talking to people who studied them for a living, was that 44 acres of established wetland in a county that had been draining its low ground for a century was not nothing. It was a question of whether you understood what you were looking at. She had a theory. The theory rested on Muscovy ducks. Not ordinary barnyard ducks. Heritage Muscovy ducks, specifically, which are large and deliberate, and almost entirely unbothered by the conditions that keep most livestock out of wetland terrain. They eat cattail roots. They work phragmites shoots before the plants can reestablish. They move through standing water with the calm efficiency of animals designed for exactly that environment. A woman named Borghild Svane, who had run a wetland restoration operation in the upper part of the state for 11 years and had come to one of Tilda's extension presentations 2 years back and stayed afterward to talk for 90 minutes, had told her this in the offhand way that experts tell you the most important things, while doing something else, not looking directly at you, as if the information wasn't particularly interesting. People think wetland restoration means heavy equipment, Borghild had said, scrolling through something on her phone. Muscovies think it means breakfast. Tilda had not forgotten that. Before we go any further, if you found this channel because you're looking for stories about what happens when you believe something everyone else has written off, hit subscribe right now. That's exactly what we do here at Western Ironwood. And I promise what's coming in the weeks ahead is worth staying for. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Now let's go back to that bottom land, because that's where everything started. The land itself didn't want her there at first. Or rather, it was simply indifferent in the way land is always indifferent. It didn't know she had a plan, and it wouldn't have cared if it did. She walked the fence line in rubber boots on a Saturday morning, and what she found was that the east fence was mostly gone, that the beaver activity had redirected Copper Creek enough to undercut 2 of the corner posts, and that the phragmites reed in the interior was so thick and tall it cut off sight lines within 20 feet. She could hear the water. She could not see it. She had enough money to get through 3 months, maybe 4 if she was careful. The severance from the county extension program had been 2 weeks of pay and a handshake. She'd been living on that, and a small amount she'd saved over 3 years of having no significant expenses, because there had been nothing to spend on. She called Borghild Svane from the fence line, standing in the mud with the reed bed rustling around her. "I inherited that wetland I told you about," Tilda said. "The Morrow County bottom." "The same one." "How bad is it?" 3 active beaver dams, phragmites bank to bank. East fence is gone. The creek's moved about 30 feet south of where the old survey shows it. Borghild was quiet for a moment. "How much standing water right now?" "Knee height in February. Spring melt's going to put another foot on that." "I know. And you're thinking Muscovies." "I'm thinking Muscovies." Another pause, longer, the thinking kind. Tilda had learned to wait out Borghild's silences by standing still and not filling the space prematurely. "I've got 18 birds I was going to sell in April," Borghild said finally. "Good stock, 2 drakes, 16 hens. They've worked a restoration project for me 2 seasons, and they know what they're doing." She paused. "I was going to sell them to a farm in Ohio, but the man in Ohio hasn't stopped negotiating for 4 months, and I'm losing patience with him." "What would you want for them?" "I'd want to know you have some kind of dry roosting area, and predator fencing, and I'd want documentation." "What kind of documentation?" "Before and after. I've been watching restored wetlands for 20 years. I want to see what 44 acres of beaver bottom looks like when it comes back properly. My research needs that kind of longitudinal data." She paused. "Cost of transport and a standing agreement to send me photographs. That's all I need." Tilda stood in the mud and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have time to examine, so she let it pass. "I'll have the roosting area built by the time you can get them here," she said. "You'd better," Borghild said, and hung up. The man who knew the land the way Tilda needed it known was named Carvel Dunn. He was 71 years old, had grown up on a farm that bordered the Kessler Bottom, and had reportedly walked every inch of the property before the phragmites moved in and made that impossible. He lived on Route 12 in a white house with green shutters and a mailbox at a slight lean, and he had the reputation, which reached Tilda through 2 separate people at the feed supply in town, of being a man who did not waste words on people who hadn't earned them. She drove to his house on a Tuesday morning and knocked without calling ahead, because calling ahead gives people a chance to decide not to be home. He opened the door and looked at her the way men who have been watching people make decisions about land look, not unfriendly, but thorough. He took in her boots, which were the kind that had actually been in mud. He took in the folder she was holding, which had the county survey maps in it. "You're Ray Kessler's niece," he said. "Yes, sir, Tilda Mercer." "The extension office girl." "Former. Program was cut." He studied her. "You taking that bottom land?" "I already took it." He stepped back from the door. "Come in." His kitchen had the smell of a house that had once had a working farm around it. Hay and machine oil and something clean and particular. There were photographs on the wall near the back window, and Tilda looked at them while he poured coffee he didn't ask if she wanted. The photographs were of fields, healthy ones, low, flat fields in summer green, with the ridgelines she recognized in the distance. "That's the bottom land," she said. 40 years ago, he said, before the beavers came back, and before anybody had figured out you couldn't drain it fast enough to keep pace with the upstream hydrology. He set a mug in front of her and sat down. "Tell me what you're thinking." She told him all of it. The Muscovies, Borghild's research, what she understood about how sustained managed foraging worked on invasive wetland species. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned his mug in his hands twice. "You know what else is on that land," he said. "Besides what's visible, no." "There's a Millrace," he said. "Old one. Stone-lined, hand-cut granite, ran from what used to be a grist mill on the north side down to Copper Creek. Built in the 1880s, decommissioned when the mill burned in 1924. The channel silted and the vegetation covered it, and nobody's seen it in probably 60 years. But stone channels don't dissolve. He looked at her. If the birds clear the vegetation the way you think they will, and if the channel's intact, it would run along the high berm on the north edge of your property. That berm is the only elevated dry ground access between the county road and the 300 acres of state wildlife management area that's otherwise completely landlocked. Tilda set down her coffee. How landlocked? No road, no access point. The state's been trying to establish a management corridor for 15 years. Every route they've looked at goes through private farmland where the owners won't sell. He paused, except from the north. From the north, the only crossing that makes sense goes right across the old mill berm on your property. And nobody's been able to see it because it's been under 10 feet of phragmites since before your uncle bought the place. She sat with that for a moment. The soil in the center section is also worth knowing about, he said. Underneath those reed beds, and I know this because I helped my father dig a fence post there in 1973, and we hit black clay at 2 feet. It's some of the richest alluvial ground in this valley. Hasn't been farmed, hasn't been stripped, hasn't been asked to do anything except sit underwater and wait. He looked at her steadily. Your land is not what it looks like. No, Tilda said. I know. He studied her. How do you know? Because I was an extension worker for 3 years, and I've seen what happens to land that gets written off. People stop looking. When people stop looking, they stop seeing. She picked up her mug. I've been looking at that parcel since February. Carvel Dunn was quiet for a long time. I'll come out and walk it with you, he said. What you do with what I tell you is your own business. It was not a yes, but it was the closest thing to one she was going to get, and she knew better than to push it. The Muscovies arrived on a wet morning in late April, 18 birds, in a livestock trailer, driven by a man named Creston, who worked for Borghild and communicated almost entirely through action rather than speech. He backed the trailer to the high ground at the north end of the property, where Tilda had spent 3 weeks clearing a roosting area, running predator fencing, and building a covered structure that was functional, if not particularly beautiful. The birds came out like they owned the place. The 2 drakes moved to the edge of the standing water, looked at the reed beds, and waded in with the calm purposefulness of animals who have been doing a specific job long enough that it no longer requires consideration. Tilda stood at the fence and watched them. Carvel had appeared that morning without being asked, the way he'd been appearing every few days since their conversation in his kitchen, quietly, with purpose, looking at the land before he spoke to her. They know what they're doing, he said. Borghild said they would. He watched the birds work the edge of the reed bed. My wife used to say that animals tell the truth about land faster than any survey. Tilda said nothing, because there was nothing that needed adding. The first season the Muscovies worked the accessible edges. They pulled cattail roots. They ate phragmite shoots before the plants could re-establish. They moved through the standing water in the natural rotation that Borghild had taught Tilda to manage, clearing a section, resting it, returning. By midsummer, Tilda could see ground in sections that had been underwater in April. She was sleeping in a small camper she'd parked on the high ground near the roosting structure, because the land had no dwelling and she wasn't paying rent anywhere else. She worked 6 days a week and most evenings. She sold eggs, Muscovy eggs, larger than chicken eggs, with a richer yolk, to 3 restaurants in the county seat once she secured the food handler certification she'd applied for in June. It wasn't enough to call comfortable, but it was real, and real, in her particular situation, was what mattered most. She thought about the Millrace often, in the way you think about something you can't see but believe is there. She'd adjusted the management rotation to keep the birds working the north section, where the old berm was, trusting Carvel's memory, trusting the logic of granite that doesn't dissolve. The Millrace announced itself in August, not with drama, but with a sound. She was moving the flock through the north section on a Tuesday morning, when one of the drakes stepped onto something that rang. A single low note, solid and resonant, like someone tapping submerged stone with a rod. The bird stepped forward, and the note came again, slightly different in pitch. Tilda crouched. The Muscovies had taken the reed growth down to 2 feet in this section over the summer, and looking along the ground she could see cut stone, Not random fieldstone, not a collapsed wall, but dressed granite blocks set in a deliberate line, tight-fitted, slightly curved in cross-section, the way a water channel is curved to maintain flow. She stood up slowly. She was not conscious of holding her breath until she let it out. She called, "Carvel." "It's here," she said. A pause. He knew what she meant. "North section. Along the berm, right where you said." "Intact?" "What I can see is intact. Clean joints, the cuts still true." She could hear him breathing on the other end. Something in his silence had texture to it. Not surprise, but something older than surprise. The quality of a man hearing something confirmed that he has known for 50 years. "I'll come Saturday," he said. "I'll start clearing it today," she said. "Don't undermine the berm." "I won't." A pause. "You know what this means. If the channel's continuous and the berm holds grade, you've got the access corridor the state has been looking for." "I know what it means," she said. "I need to know what it's worth before anyone else figures it out." She spent 4 days uncovering the Millrace with the patience she'd built over a season of working with birds that did not reward hurrying. What came into the light was 300 feet of hand-cut granite channel, sound and true, following the natural grade of the berm from the county road access point down to the creek junction. The stone was dry-laid, held by its own geometry, and a century of accumulated weight and stability. Nobody had built it to be admired. They had built it to last. She sent Carvel photographs with no caption. He responded, "Better than I remembered it." The developer's name was Preston Alt. He came from Knoxville in a clean truck, and he arrived at her camper on a Thursday morning in October with a card and the careful neutral expression of a man who has done this many times and has learned what his face should and should not do. He offered $94,000 for the full parcel, land, channel rights, the access berm. She looked at him across the small table where the survey maps were already laid out and had been, deliberately, before he arrived. "What's the state wildlife management area worth with a legal access corridor?" she said. He didn't answer. "You've had it assessed," she said. "Otherwise you wouldn't know what to offer me." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, just a recalibration. "I'm not selling," she said. "If you want to come back with a legitimate easement proposal, independently assessed, going through my attorney, I'll hear it. But I'd suggest doing that after you've had someone look at what the access is actually worth to your project. Because what you've offered reflects what this land looked like 14 months ago, not what it is now." He picked up his card from the edge of the table where she'd left it. He put it back in his pocket. "I'll be in touch," he said. "You will," she said. The flood came in March, the second spring after the Muscovies arrived. 3 weeks of rain on top of a wet February, and it hit the low farmland in the county the way floods hit when the land has been drained and tiled for 80 years and has nothing left to absorb with. The creek came up fast. The fields in the lower basin went under. The Kessler bottom flooded too. That was expected. What nobody had mapped until the water came was that the managed wetland, with its cleared channels and restored natural drainage path, with a winter's worth of Muscovy work opening the interior reed beds, began pulling floodwater from the adjacent fields with a slow and steady efficiency that reduced the depth on 2 neighboring farms by measurable inches over 48 hours. The old Millrace berm held dry and elevated above it all, carrying overflow in the direction it had been designed to carry overflow in 1887, when the men who built it understood the hydrology of this valley better than the people who'd come after them. Harv Ostroff, who ran cattle on the farm to the east, came to her fence line on the 3rd day with the look of a man who has been revising something he thought he understood. "Your land's pulling the water," he said. "The channels are working," she said. "The birds cleared enough of the reed beds that the natural drainage is running again." He looked at the water moving through her property. He looked at the berm, elevated and dry, the stone channel carrying overflow the way it was meant to. "I would have lost my lower pasture," he said. 20 acres of winter wheat. "The berm helped redirect the surface flow," she said. He was quiet. The county's been saying for years there was no flood mitigation option for this drainage basin. They weren't looking at the right land. she said. He put his hand out over the fence rail. She shook it. Whatever you need from me, he said. You come find me first. She didn't make a thing of it. She nodded and went back to checking on her birds. Preston Alt came back in May. He drove slower this time, coming up the access track. He got out and stood by his vehicle and waited for her to come to him, which told her something about how his calculation had changed. He said he'd been thinking about the easement terms she'd described. He said the offer would be annual, not a one-time purchase, indexed over a renewable period, and that he'd had the access value independently assessed as she'd requested. She gave him her attorney's name. She told him the terms she was willing to consider: creek and wetland impact review provisions, notice periods before any development activity on the eastern parcel. Language she and the attorney in Asheville had spent 2 months drafting. He said he thought it was workable. He said it without enthusiasm, but also without the studied neutrality of the first 2 visits. Something in him had settled into a more straightforward register. She shook his hand and told him to call her attorney directly. After his truck was gone, she stood in the cleared center section and looked at what the land had become in 14 months. The south section showed early recovery growth, low grasses pushing up through the old root mat, the kind of thin green that means the soil biology underneath is waking up. The Millrace was uncovered, documented, filed with the county recorder. The roosting structure needed 1 more season of weatherproofing, and she had plans for that. The birds were working the interior, on a rotation she'd written on a laminated card she kept in her jacket pocket, because the schedule was too detailed to hold entirely in her head, and she'd stopped being too proud about that sometime in September. Carvel came the following Saturday, as he'd been coming most Saturdays, and they walked the north berm together in the May morning. The creek was running high but clean. The Millrace channel carried a thin, clear current along its original grade, doing what it had been cut to do by men whose names were not recorded anywhere she'd been able to find. Carvel put his hand on the granite edging of the channel. He held it there for a moment. "My father showed me this when I was 9 years old," he said, "before the reeds covered it." She didn't say anything, because the moment didn't need it, and she had learned over the past year which moments those were. He said whoever built it right, Carvel said, and that things built right outlast the people who doubted them. He took his hand off the stone and looked out over the cleared sections, over the birds working the water below, over the low green of a wetland remembering what it was. He wasn't wrong about that. They stood at the channel in the May morning, and the water ran, and the Muscovies moved in the reed beds below, and the ridgelines held the sky the way they had always held it, indifferent and permanent, and exactly what they were. 44 acres, that a county clerk had stamped with barely concealed amusement on a February morning 14 months ago. 44 acres of what Morrow County called a tax liability, and what Tilda Mercer had recognized. From the first day she'd stood at the fence line in mud up to her boot tops, as a question no one had bothered to answer. She was answering it, one cleared section at a time, one bird working the water in the way birds work when you stop trying to manage them and start trusting them to know what they know. The land was not finished. It would not be finished for years, and some parts of it would never be finished in the way of anything that depends on living systems moving on their own schedule. It was imperfect and specific and entirely hers. She walked back down the berm in the May morning, and the ducks moved on the water below her, and the Millrace ran clean, and the work that was waiting for her was immediate and concrete and required no justification from anyone. That was enough. That had always been the whole of it.